You can't turn on the news right now without being reminded that things feel a little unstable. We're constantly being inundated with multiple foreign conflicts, geopolitical tension, and now midterm elections are coming up. And when that kind of information shows up consistently, it's natural to wonder what that means for your portfolio, your plans, and your long-term financial security. That concern is absolutely understandable. I'm Christiana Lovelace. I'm a licensed financial advisor and accredited asset management specialist, and I own Diamond Point Financial. What I want to do today is slow that conversation down. Because while global events and politics matter, long-term financial strategy operates on a very different timeline than the news cycle. This week's perspective is about understanding how politics, markets, and economics intersect and where perspective helps separate information from noise. During politically charged periods, one question comes up again and again. Does the market do better under one political party than the other? And it's a fair question, especially when political divisions feel heightened and headlines feel constant. But it's also a question that oversimplifies how markets actually work. Markets don't respond to political labels. They respond to conditions, incentives, and expectations. When we step back and look at long-term market history, what becomes very clear is that markets have advanced through every political environment. Democratic administrations, Republican administrations, divided governments, united governments, periods of gridlock, and sweeping reform. We'll get more into this next week, but something that often surprises people is that some of the strongest long-term market periods have occurred during periods of political division, when no single party holds both Congress and the presidency. That's because markets tend to favor predictability over ideology. When power is divided, large-scale policy changes become harder to implement quickly, which slows the pace of everything. Businesses are better able to plan capital investments with greater confidence because the rules of the game are less likely to change abruptly. Now, this doesn't mean markets don't like change, they just don't like unpredictable change. Markets are forward-thinking systems. They don't wait for laws to pass or policies to be enacted. They price in expectations, sometimes months or even years in advance. So by the time something feels obvious in the news, the markets have often already adjusted. Now, speaking of uncertainty, as I mentioned, we have midterm elections this year. Historically, midterm years tend to be more volatile and less rewarding in the short term, especially in the months leading up to the election. Since 1950, the average return for the S&P 500 in the 12 months leading up to the midterm election has actually been close to flat. Progress has historically been harder to come by during these times, and volatility tends to increase. Midterm years also tend to experience larger drawdowns throughout the year, and this is a direct reflection of uncertainty around elections, policy direction, and potential shifts in leadership. The good news? Typically, once the midterm election is behind us, uncertainty begins to clear. Markets often enter a more constructive phase. Since 1950, the 12 months following a midterm election have produced average returns of over 16%, making it the strongest period on average in the 4-year presidential cycle. That's why I'm eager to see how 2026 responds, mainly because in 2025, we experienced elevated volatility earlier in the year. Headlines were constant and uncertainty was high, and while 2025 was not a midterm year, it shared many of the same characteristics. Statistically, after periods of elevated volatility, markets often become more stable. It's not as common to see 2 years consecutively of that kind of volatility, but that doesn't mean 2026 will be extraordinary either. In reality, it will likely fall somewhere in the middle. And this is where my role as a professional becomes important. My job is not to predict the future, it's to balance behavior with data, to understand the numbers, recognize historical patterns, and manage the emotional side of decision making. And of course, instinct does play a role in that process. My instinct is built on my experience over the last 20 years of studying the stock market. But instinct cannot operate well under fear. When emotion is high, instinct gets distorted. That's why discipline matters, context matters. I have to rely on facts as I see them, not headlines, not reactions, and certainly not predictions. Markets don't respond to fear either. They respond to changes in expectations. That's why even when economic conditions may not seem as strong, the market might respond well because at least it knows what to expect. Now, before I move on, it's important to be clear. These are just historical tendencies, not guarantees. Past performance does not predict future results, and markets are influenced by many factors beyond just election cycles. But understanding these patterns helps investors avoid reacting emotionally during periods of stress, and helps explain why some of the strongest market advances have followed some of the most uncomfortable years. And that idea naturally brings us into economics. For your economic insight this week, we're discussing scarcity and choice. As we discussed last week, economics is a social science. It studies how individuals, businesses, and governments make decisions when resources are limited. Those resources, like time, money, labor, and capital, are all finite. That's what we call scarcity. And because resources are very limited, every decision involves trade-offs. That's where choice comes in. A great example of this is the U.S. jobs report. It's easy to assume that strong employment data is always positive. And that's not necessarily wrong because it can signal economic strength. However, at the same time, strong employment data can increase pressure on wages. Wage pressure can contribute to inflation. Inflation influences interest rates. And interest rates, as we've seen, affect borrowing, spending, and investment behavior. No single data point exists in isolation. Everything is interconnected, and when resources are scarce, every outcome reflects a series of choices. This is why I love studying behavioral economics. Most people are not naturally wired to evaluate complex systems in real time. Our instinct is to react to headlines, which can cause us to overvalue recent information, which affects how we make choices. Fear, through human evolution, is a hardwired response designed to protect us from immediate threats. It has a powerful impact on behavior. And as a result, we tend to fear loss more than we value gain. And that imbalance often pushes us to act when patience would be more effective. Understanding scarcity and choice helps put economic data back into context. It shifts the focus from reacting to individual headlines to recognizing how interconnected systems evolve over time. That understanding doesn't necessarily eliminate uncertainty, but it can help reduce those emotionally driven decisions or added stress. Now, considering the trade-offs of scarcity and choice, let's move on to building your long-term strategy. Again, here in January, we're starting at the very beginning, setting your financial goals. Last week, we focused on defining what success looks like, and this week, we're discussing the habits that truly support that progress. I hate to break it to you, but financial success will require some discipline. Most financial goals don't fail because they lack motivation. They fail because habits don't consistently support them. You might be thinking, well, that's not me, I'm not disciplined, but I think you'd be surprised. Most people already have areas where they're more disciplined, they just don't think about it in that way. Maybe you're consistent with your calendar, maybe you maintain a fitness routine, or you're really reliable at work and you always meet deadlines. Those habits exist because the discipline is there, the reward is clear, and so is the consequence. Discipline is not a natural trait that people are born with. It's built up over time, and in a lot of situations, it comes from necessity. When we shower regularly, it's not because it's exciting, it's because we understand what happens if we don't. The consequence is immediate, and it's pretty obvious. Financial habits work in the same way. Progress improves when rewards are meaningful and consequences are understood. This week, I want you to identify the habits you already do well. Write them down if you need to, and then consider how those same structures can support areas where follow-through has been harder for you. A lot of times, consistency in one area can be borrowed to support another, and awareness always comes before change. Next week, we'll start working on an action plan that incorporates this newfound discipline and utilizes the tools that can help you reach your financial goals. Before we close, I want to continue to share some behind the scenes here at Diamond Pointe. January marks 1 year since we moved into our downtown space. And this space is designed intentionally for collaboration, conversation, and long-term strategy. It offered us space to grow internally and for our new clients. One of my favorite aspects is that it allowed us to create this dedicated studio where discussions like the Pointe Perspective can take place, giving us the opportunity to help more people improve their financial lives. In many ways, this space reflects the same philosophy we apply to financial planning. Structure matters, environment matters, and decisions made with intention tend to hold up over time. In closing, please remember that political headlines will always compete for attention, economic data will always generate debate, and markets will always move. But long-term strategy is built through discipline and consistency, not reaction. Now, I hope this added some useful perspective to financial topics that can feel intimidating and overwhelming. And if you'd like to continue this discussion, please consider subscribing to our Pointe Perspective newsletter that comes out every Friday. You can also subscribe here to our channel where these videos come out every Thursday. Until next week, take care.